Trojan was released in February of 1987. Developed and published by Capcom, Trojan is a drastically scaled down NES port of the arcade game released the previous year. This side-scrolling action game was the fourth game published by Capcom on the NES. The game's plot is set in a dystopian, post-apocalyptic future where you've been hired to take out an evil dictator and his gang. The game is fairly simple gameplay, with the majority of the levels having you either walk left until you reach the boss or going down until you reach the boss. You have two main abilities to help you reach your goal. The A button will throw up your shield and the B button will have you attack with your sword. Some enemies can destroy your sword and shield, and if that happens, you're only left with the ability to punch and kick enemies, with a far less range than the sword. The majority of enemies in this game seem to spawn completely at random, coming from the left or right sides of the screen. Some stationary enemies on some levels will always appear in the same spot. Trojan has 6 stages in the game, and all of them are actually pretty short, and usually have you doing a side-scrolling part, mini-boss, another side-scrolling part, and then the level's actual boss. Some levels feature sewer areas where you can enter by jumping down manholes, which will sometimes have power-ups. Although for the most part this game is fairly straightforward, go from point A to point B kind of a game, but the game does feature some rudimentary puzzles on some levels. For instance, on the 4th level you have to obtain keys to progress past certain parts of the level. A major downside of Trojan is the game moves like molasses. The default walk speed feels really slow and clunky and really detracts from the game. You're able to move faster by jumping, but it's still a very slow, methodical action game. The game is quite difficult until you get the hang of it, and even then it still remains fairly difficult. A lot of this is from how slow and clunky the game is, but if you learn to use the jump ability to your advantage, it makes the game much more playable. Trojan, due to the way enemies spawn on the levels, has a lot of flicker and looks like a glitchy mess. With how short the game actually is, it almost feels like the game's unfinished. I think if you spend an hour or two with the game, you could probably master it enough to beat it in under 15 minutes every time you play. Trojan's gameplay, while fairly inaccessible due to its slow speed, does get funner the more you play it, and if you're actually willing to give it some time. That being said, the slow movement speed could be seen as a deal breaker for many that attempt this NES title. Graphically, the game looks pretty poor now, but when compared to other games released around the same time, it actually has pretty decent graphics. The environments are some of the most detailed seen thus far in 1987, with more complex looking backgrounds and levels. The game's sprites look pretty average for the era, but the environments really shine. The main downside of the graphics is how glitchy the game appears, with the screen occasionally flashing and enemies spawning and despawning, sometimes without reason. Trojan's music is okay. It features a diverse soundtrack for the time, with original music for every level in the game. However, most of the music isn't great. It definitely lacks the heavy-hitting tracks Capcom would be known for later on the console. Overall, Trojan is a syrupy, slow action game with extremely short levels and somewhat engaging boss fights. When given a chance, the game does have some depth to its combat, however it's hard to get into with how slow the game plays. The game overall feels very middle of the road. There's some redeeming features of the game, however there's a lot of problems. Play it, or don't. You're not missing out on much if you don't. NES Chronology is a Patreon-supported show, and would not be possible without the support of its patrons. If you'd like to support the show and receive some perks, click the logo and give what you can.